Hello, my name is Xenophon Babadimitris. I'm a professor in radiology and biomedical imaging and biomedical engineering at Yale. This interview is part of a collection of conversations with experts in medical software from academia, industry, and regulatory agencies, and is supplementary material for a Coursera class Introduction to Medical Software that will appear in the fall of 2021. Our guest today is Mr. Rich Wynkoop, who is the CEO of the consulting company Vision 27 based in Oregon. Talk us about regulatory consulting and quality management system, risk management, and ISO certification, and all those things that all medical device manufacturers need to do in order to establish themselves in the market and be able to sell products. So, Rich, thank you for joining us, and I look forward to having a good conversation about that.
Well, thank you so much for allowing me to be part of this. It's really an honor, and I appreciate it very much. So, hi, my name's Rich Wynkoop. I'm the president and CEO of Vision 28. And Vision 28 is a quality and regulatory consulting company. And what we do is we help entrepreneurs and small companies navigate the US Food Drug Administration regulations and the European medical device regulations to bring their products to market. By training, I'm an electronics engineer. And for 15 years, I designed new medical devices. And then I moved into quality and regulatory for the next 25 years. I've been a plant quality manager, director of quality and regulatory, vice president of quality and regulatory, and I retired in 2015. But who knew? I got bored. So I acquired Vision 28 in 2016, and I've been having a lot of fun ever since.
Okay, Rich, thank you for answering our questions for our students. I think they'll find it informative and they'll get a little bit of a better appreciation of what quality management systems are and why they are important for a company to have in place. That started here. So we'll start with the basic question. And remember, many of the people, these are geared towards the students who are entering the device industry or are thinking about entering the device industry, who have heard some of these terms, but are not super familiar with everything. So let's start with a quality management system. At a very high level, how does one start? How do you set up one? Obviously, they call people like you, but I just want to hear more about the process. What does it actually look like? What is the process here?
Absolutely. So setting up a quality management system is something we do all the time for our clients. And what we do is we start with some templates for a general quality management system. Now, the basic elements of a quality management system are the quality manual that describes the system and the company, document controls for approving and implementing documents, management responsibility for having your management really own the system, and then management of personnel, facilities, work environment, and then product realization and the design and manufacture of the product, corrective and preventive actions, risk analysis, and customer feedback. So what we do with our clients is we help them integrate their current processes into the template, and then we develop any processes that they may be missing from the template. And after we have them running for a while and they're comfortable with it, we'll have a third party come in and audit what we've done to see that we've implemented it correctly.
Okay, so there are two, let's say, main threads to this quality management system process. We have the American system under the FDA regulations, and then later we'll talk about the ISO certification and what happens in the European Union and places that use that. But let's briefly summarize what the situation is in the United States. And I understand that in the United States, you're dealing with the FDA directly, its own rules and its own auditing procedures, but how does that work?
Absolutely. So in the United States, if you want to sell a medical device, you'll need to generally, there's always exceptions to the rules, get FDA's approval if you have a high risk or moderate risk device. You don't need FDA's approval if you have a low risk device, generally. And these are called class 3 for high risk, class 2 for moderate, and class 1 for low risk. In all cases, you'll need to register your establishment and list your device in the FDA's database so that they know about you. And then generally every 3 years, you can expect a visit from FDA to audit your establishment and see if you're in compliance with the federal regulations. So FDA does its own audits. Now, the FDA's regulation is for the QMS is in the federal registers, the federal regulations, and European regulations is in the MDR 217/745. Those are the basic differences. Now, in Europe, they have a system where they have approved notified bodies to do their audits and certifications. So the FDA does their own examination and approval, and in Europe, notified bodies do the examination and approval.
And notified by bodies, just to sort of fill in here, are private companies effectively who are delegated by the government authorities to do that, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Unlike the US, for the EU, you actually need ISO certification, and you have a new company, they call you. What are the first steps towards getting ISO certified? What does this process look like?
Yeah, we can go into that. That's a question we get all the time. And so to understand the ISO model, we're going to focus on the EU process. There's 3 areas of certification that you'll get certified in. One is that the company complies with the EU Medical Device Regulation 2017/45, and we'll call that the MDR. The second area is that your quality system meets the requirements of the MDR. And the third area is that the certification of your products meet the requirements of the MDR.
When people hear ISO certification, the big world out there, they hear ISO 9001. Is that what we're talking about here, or are we talking about more specific things?
Yeah, if your product's a medical device, you'll need to be certified to ISO 13485/2016. On the other hand, if you have a commercial product, ISO 9001 would be appropriate. ISO 9001 is not suitable for a medical device.
Yeah, so that's the parent standard effectively, of which 13485 is the derived standard in many ways. So a medical device manufacturer would need to be certified to ISO 13485. How does that happen?
Yes, that's a second area of certification I mentioned, and it's actually contained in the MDR under Article 10. 1345 is recognized as a quality management system that will meet these requirements, and a certification to 1345 will satisfy those requirements.
And then the third area you had mentioned before was we need product certification. So what's that about? How does that look?
Yeah, well, the MDR is comprised of a main body, and that main body is divided up into 10 chapters, 123 articles, and many paragraphs. The main body is also accompanied by 17 annexes. Oh my gosh, so where is it in this? The main body establishes the regulations, and those annexes specify what documents need to be provided to show compliance. For your product to be certified, you must provide the documentation specified in the annexes. So the body says what you need to do, and the annexes say how you need to do it. For example, 2 annexes for the medical device products are Annex 1, which describes general safety and performance requires, and Annex 2 describes the technical documentation that must be provided to demonstrate the safety and effectiveness of your product.
Yeah, it's a long document. I was looking through it the other day.
It's a mess.
Compared to like the American regulations, which is a relatively short document by comparison, maybe too short perhaps. So now let's say we get a call from a client, they want to be ISO certified. So what is the process? What happens next?
Well, great. So now that we have kind of an understanding of certification, we can talk about the 4 steps to get your company certified and your products and your system certified. For our discussion, we'll assume that the client is not new to medical devices and has a quality system and produces products in the United States, but they're not compliant to 1345. So the first step would be to review their quality system, make sure they're following it and that it's complete. And we'll do this by reviewing all of their elements, such as their quality manual, quality plans, training program, all of those things we mentioned earlier in terms of what comprises a quality system. And we'll look at those and make sure they align to 1345. Then we'll look at their product documentation and the other elements required by the MDR in their company. Then we use an external auditor to look at our remediations and get an independent review that help us identify those gaps.
So just to sort of stop the flow here a little bit. So essentially, your quality management for the United States and your quality management system for the European Union regulations, the ISO 1345, overlap, but they're not identical. And so you effectively have to work on the union of those two sets if you want to be in both areas, correct?
Exactly. There are a lot of similarities. The two systems are getting closer and closer and closer through a lot of international harmonization work, but there's still gaps and significant gaps just from the two systems, and we help harmonize those together.
Right, because you have to have one company, you have to have one quality system, otherwise
Exactly.
it doesn't function. So the first step now is to determine if you're ready for certification, right? So where do we go?
That's the purpose of this step. Certification is not the time to find out you have a body of work to do before you can be certified.
Okay, and the second step, where do we go?
The second step is we're going to contact what's known as a notified body to perform a quality assessment. Now, notified bodies, as we mentioned earlier, are private organizations authorized under Chapter 4 of the MDR to assess the compliance of manufacturers to 1348.5 and other EU regulations. Manufacturer may apply to a notified body of its choice, but you can't have more than one. You can't have two. So if you don't like the results of notified body A, you can't go out and get notified body B. During this initial contact, you learn about your notified body, what specific documents they emphasize, and you'll set up a schedule of review. Now, in the schedule of review, there's typically two audits. The first audit by the notified body will be an initial assessment to identify the gaps between your existing documents and what the notified body expects to see to show compliance. Then the second audit will be the certification audit. So you have your first one to identify the gaps that they find, and then the second one will be the certification, and in between you fix those gaps.
Okay. And then presumably they're doing an initial assessment at that point to see where you are.
Yes, that's correct. The third step is to have the notified body visit your facility and perform an initial assessment audit. The audit may be 1 or 2 days by one person. At the end of this audit, you'll receive a report indicating positive and negative findings and a judgment if you're ready for a certification audit. Nonconformities found in this audit need to be corrected before you schedule your second audit.
So as an aside here, so a notified body audit and an FDA audit are similar but different. How does a custom, is this a similar process or are they different processes? How does that work out when they come in?
Yeah, so the FDA is a lot different. And so say I have a medical product and I want to get it on the market. I'll have the product, and if it's a class 2 or class 3, I need to put together a package very similar to the technical documentation to have that reviewed and approved by the FDA. Now that's analogous to the notified body certifying your product against Annex 1 and Annex 2 technical documentation. Now, after I have FDA's approval, I can enter the market. However, with the notified body, after I get my product certifications, I still need to be certified to 1345, and I still need to be certified that I follow all the MDRs, and I get those certifications. Then I can put a CE mark on my product that says I've done all this, and then I can ship into the EU. So the process is much more difficult in some aspects to get into the EU.
So, okay, so back to the main conversation here. We had the initial audit. What happens if this doesn't go well? What does it mean for a client if they get lots of things flagged?
So if you have lots of things flagged and and it's before your certification audit, that gives you time to make those fixes. And you can work with the notified body to help fix those to make sure that they come back again with another second assessment audit prior to your certification audit to help you get certified. But that's time, it's money, and you're losing money because you're not on the market. So it really pays to hit it hard. Because the fourth step is your certification audit. And when they come in for your certification audit, that may be more than one person, and it's going to take several days. And if you have significant findings, you will not be certified, and you'll need another audit and spend more money and more time off the market.
And then if everything goes well, you get your certificate, you get your MDR certificate, you get declaration of conformities, and now you're ready. So how does that get you from there to sort of a CE mark and ready to enter the European Union market now?
So once you have your certifications, we're at that certification audit, everything went well. You have your 1345 certificate, you have your MDR certificate, and you have your product declaration of conformities, and now you're ready to go to market. So in order to go to commercialize your devices, a CE mark is needed. So from the manufacturer's perspective, their MDR certificate allows them to place a CE mark under their product. And the CE mark, folks out there have probably seen it. It's a C and an E, very, very well defined. And then for class 2 and 3 products, the 2A, and 3 products, they have the notified body's number underneath the CE mark for medical devices. So you have your CE mark, and when your product is examined at the border by a market surveillance or regulatory enforcement agent, the agent will be able to see the CE mark and see that you comply, and then allow it into the European Union. So from the EU perspective, a CE mark signifies the manufacturer's company, quality system, and products have been certified by a notified body as being compliant to the MDR and ISO 1345, and therefore they are safe and effective, and they are qualified to be sold in the European Union.
Okay, so let's dig in a little bit here. You've sort of gave us an overview of the process. Now, what are audits? So we are now at the end. We mentioned audits before, but what do these things look like? What are audits specifically?
Okay. So audits, there's an ISO standard for audits, as there's an ISO standard for a lot of other things. And the ISO standard for audits is 19011. And it defines the audit as being, and I quote, a systematic, independent, and documented process for obtaining objective evidence and evaluating it objectively to determine the extent to which the audit criteria are fulfilled. Oh my gosh. So what that means is it gives you a framework to compare 1345 or the MDR against our client's quality system and procedures to see if they are alignment and they're fulfilled. So in the regulatory world, simply put, audit criteria are defined by the regulations being audited against. For example, in the United States, the audit criteria are documented in the Code of Federal Regulations, and in the European Union and many other countries, the criteria are documented in the MDR.
ISO 1345, presumably.
Yes.
Are there, actually, out of curiosity here, outside the European Union and the United States, are other regulatory zones using ISO 13485 certification as well for their quality systems?
Many companies use the 1345 certification as well. A lot of them do. More of them do than don't. And so Japan, for instance, 1345 works well in their systems as well. And Canada is based upon 13485, and folks are starting to get closer and closer to the 1345.
But not in the US at this point, although you had mentioned something that there's an international certification. Speaking
Yes,
of clean
there's
quality.
a program out called the MDSAP, Medical Device Single Audit Program. And the MDSAP is a collection of companies, excluding Europe, countries, 7 countries, and they follow audits that are based upon 1345, and they have exceptions for each country, and they have private companies that are paid to do these audits, and they are acceptable. And I think that is the doorway to global harmonization.
Okay, let's get back to the details of the audit here, having taken the big picture. So what are the elements of an audit that a company could expect when they're being audited by a notified body for ISO certification, or perhaps in this harmonized system, assume the two are going to be similar ultimately?
Okay, so say we're going to conduct an audit, and we're going to come over and maybe to your company conduct an audit. We'll have a basic structure of the audit. There'll be the pre-audit, the audit, the closing meeting, and then an audit report. So during a pre-audit phase, the auditor will review the client's product line and may select the highest risk medical devices to audit. So if you make a defibrillator and you make a tongue depressor, you'd audit the defibrillator, not the tongue depressor. So this way, potentially serious deficiencies that may lead to patient involvement can be identified. The auditor may also request documentation such as the company's quality manual, quality procedures, device technical documentation for pre-review. And from this information, the auditor will construct and communicate an audit plan.
Okay, so we're in the pre-audit phase here, and the goal is to scope out the audit and figure out what they're actually looking for, identify what the company does and what is their areas of interest, correct?
Exactly, exactly. With this orientation to the client's business, an auditor can construct an audit plan and can identify the needed number of auditors and the number of audit days. And they'll also structure on this day, these people will be looking at these parts. So then the audit occurs. You'll start out with an opening meeting. And quite frankly, the auditee is best served when their top management attends the opening meeting to show the auditor that the company takes the audit seriously and will give the auditor its full support. The auditor will go over the audit schedule and then ask if there's any questions.
Okay, and so what is the schedule like at this point? So we have now set up the process. What are we looking at?
Well, that's a great question. Audits will follow 1345 and will hit all of the elements of 1345. And those elements include management responsibility, design and development, purchasing, production and service, customer feedback, corrective and preventive actions. The auditor will spend time in each of these areas comparing the procedures and the company's records to see if the procedures and records comply with the requirements of 1345. The audit schedule will let the company know what day and time each section is expected to be audited. And by the way, if the procedures and records don't comply with the regulations, the auditor will write up the findings that will need to be corrected. If there's a large number of findings, or if the findings are really significant, they will need to be verified as corrected by the notified body in order for the company to be ISO certified.
So companies actually fail their audits, correct? This is not a pro forma process.
Yes, it is not a guaranteed win. You go in there and you could lose your certification. On the other hand, medical device companies attain ISO certification all the time and maintain their certification all the time. So if the manufacturers apply themselves in a good faith to the effort, they should succeed.
Yeah. Okay, so we have the opening meeting over. So we have procedures, we have regulations. How does the audit go about doing this here?
Well, that's kind of where the audit magic happens. I think of an example of production records would be a great way to explain the process. Let's suppose the manufacturer is producing a molded plastic device, say an IV drip chamber. When an auditor takes the specifications for the drip chamber and examines the production instructions, and they're looking to make sure that the instructions have the assembler measure and record the dimensions and other important characteristics in the IV chamber specification. So they're comparing the device specs against what they're building. Now, production typically has data that needs to be entered into forms that become the production record. These data often include pass or fail criteria. Now, an auditor can't examine every one of the records if the manufacturer is making 5,000 chambers a month. So what they'll do is they'll sample a number of production records for the chamber. And again, the sampling is based upon risk. If it's a low risk device, they may only look at 10 or 20 records. If it's a high risk device, they may sample, 80 records. So the auditor will examine the records against the instructions and see if there's any issues. An example of a serious issue would be if an important parameter failed a test, but the devices were not removed from production and an investigation was not started. That would be an example of a very significant issue.
And if they follow something like this, they get sidetracked now, your audit goes sideways, that's where you start getting in trouble effectively.
Yeah, that's what auditors like to call pulling the string. They found this little thread of interesting occurrence, and now they're going to pull the string and see where it leads. So if there's a failure, a non-conforming report should be filed. If there's a trend in non-conforming reports, a corrective and preventive action should be initiated. The results of the CAPA may be modification of the production process, and therefore those production instructions we started looking at the beginning should have been updated with the findings after the failure occurred. In this case, the auditor would pull that string of events to make sure they have been done. If they have not been done, the auditor would write a negative finding. If the issue resulting in non-conforming product in the field, that would be pretty serious, and your ISO certification could be in jeopardy.
And they will repeat this thing, assume for each element of the process, go through, check, pull the string when they have to, and continue on, correct?
Yes, it is. It's really a complexity of the audit and the potential effects of nonconformity on the company's business plans. Audits are considered by many corporations as an all-hands event. Because as they started pulling the string into the corrective and preventive action, they could find other issues that were not taken care of and could have a very serious impact on the business.
And I assume, if I think about grading as a teacher here,
Yes.
and if you start looking too deeply into things, you'll always find something. So you don't want them to get too interested, presumably.
Exactly.
Okay, so we have been through the audit, they have done all this, and now we're ready for the end, right? The audit is complete. So what happens at the end of the audit process?
Well, now it's time for the closing meeting. And again, it's important for top management to be at that closing meeting to give them an opportunity to understand the findings and ask clarifying questions. At this point in time, the closing meeting may be the highest risk to their business plan. So at this meeting, the auditor is going to go over their findings and explain the evidence for the findings. The auditees can ask questions and get clarifications, and the auditor will make sure that the attendees understand the findings, and then they'll conclude the audit.
Before we go on, you've mentioned a couple of times, you kept emphasizing you want the top management there.
Yes.
And you've alluded to that, but let's talk a little bit about that. I mean, so quality management systems are seen by some people as like boring sets of rules that other people have to follow. But effectively, you're saying the top management needs to be engaged in this process completely. So let's talk a little bit more about that.
Absolutely. So if there's a couple of types of clients that you can have, a couple cultures in companies. For instance, a culture may be, I'm going to just hire the most inexpensive folks I can to take care of this quality business over here, because that's not my business. And then there's the type of folks who say, we make medical devices, they help people, and it's very important that we do it correctly and within the law, and they have very large quality systems. The first folks really aren't going to be successful in the medical device field, and it's all driven by top management because that's what top management expects. In the company where they're very committed to quality, that comes from top management. The company is top management. And that's why 1345 and the FDA regulations have very important sections on management responsibility, management review, and management accountability.
Yeah, that's okay. So we've talked about the ISO process where you're sort of essentially submitting yourself to an audit as part of your certification here. How do audits happen in the United States? Presumably, the FDA will not knock on my door tomorrow because I'm not in any list that they have as a producing company. So how do they find out about you, and how often do they come your way as well here?
That's a great question. So again, as we said earlier, if you have a high risk or moderate risk device, you need to get FDA approval. And moderate risk device class 2s generally go through the 510K process, where you'll send FDA your technical documentation, very similar to Annex 1 and Annex 2 in the MDR, and they'll review that documentation. If it's a class 2 medical device, it's called a pre-market notification, and they will clear your device. If it's a class 3 device, it's called a pre-market approval, and they will approve your device. The PMA is a very expensive and very difficult process. The 510K on the pre-market notification is not simple and it's not cheap, but much less so than the PMA. So after you have, and if you have a class 1 device, you don't need to go through that. But what you do after either of those cases, you register your establishment that you build your device, specify your device, and take your complaints in. So one or more registrations to FDA. So now you're in their database. And you list your devices that you sell or support into their database. So now you're into their database. So every 3 years by policy, FDA is supposed to inspect every medical device company. Well, there's more companies than there are inspectors. So every 3 to 5 years, depending upon risk and your complaint activity with FDA, you can expect a visit from FDA to audit your establishment and products to see if you're in compliance with federal regs.
So do you get a call saying we're coming tomorrow? Is this a scheduled thing? How does that work?
Well, it depends. I've been through a lot of FDA audits. Generally speaking, they will call you up and tell you when they are coming. And by law, it has to be during normal business hours. If they say we're going to come on January 31st, and you say, well, that's not convenient for me, they will say, I'm sorry to hear that. We're coming on January 31st. Because they don't want you to fix any glaring things. So they just keep their schedule. But they don't have to call you. I got a call one day and said, Rich, there's 2 FDA inspectors at our front desk. And I went down and I had an audit. And so they do not need to give you pre-notice.
With part 2 of the discussion, we've talked about quality management systems. Now we're ready to talk about risk management. That's the other part of what we had planned to talk about when we planned this discussion. What is risk management? How do you integrate it in? How do you train people? Why is it such a critical process in this business?
Absolutely. Well, risk management is very well integrated into 1345 quality system. And 1345 has provisions where risk management is required in the design of medical devices. And they require it in order to identify hazards and hazardous situations at the beginning of the design process. So for instance, during the design of a device, risks are identified in the medical device specifications, and those risks are traced through the design in a trace matrix. And these trace matrices take the specifications of the device and then look through the design, trace them through the design, then through the validation and verification testing and the risk analysis. And that demonstrates that the specifications have been met, the device performance meets its intended use, and all the risks are mitigated.
So just to back up a little bit here. So once upon a time, people wanted something to be fully safe, I guess, but that's impossible to accomplish in anything more than the simplest possible thing. So risk management is what was developed to handle complicated situations where, well, we cannot be fully safe, but we can figure out what could go wrong and make sure it doesn't cause significant harm. So can you just talk a little bit more about that transition in thinking as well?
Yes. So 14971, which is the ISO risk management standard, has a clause in there that says risks are to be mitigated as far as practicable. Now, and then FDA, years past, didn't fully embrace that. They're getting closer to that. So what that means is you need to reduce your risk as far as possible. And that may mean that if you have a risk that can't be fully mitigated and it has very serious results, that at least you'll have a multi-failure point safety margin in there. So if I have a risk that is very minor and I can totally eliminate it by spending another $100 per product, I can have a rationale as to why I don't need to do that. So that's kind of how that, as far as practicable, enters the equation.
Mm-hmm. So what we've talked about so far is design, going back to the main thread of the discussion. So the design is finished. What happens years later? The designers have all moved on. Perhaps the memory of that device went away with them. So what happens? Where are we here?
Okay, so we're in production and we have in our risk analysis, we've identified some essential design outputs, which were changes made or which were put in to mitigate risks that were in the product. So these mitigations are designed into the product to bring down the risk to an acceptable level. So now the people who've designed this have moved on to another project, another company or wherever. Now the institutional knowledge of those mitigations are gone. So if I have a cost reduction team and they say, well, I can take $25 per product out if I change this design here, they'll be able to go back to the risk analysis and the essential design outputs and determine that, yeah, I can't really take these out because they're mitigating this hazard.
Because you don't want to lose risk control effectively. You don't want your residual risk, I guess, in the terminology, to go up during a cost reduction exercise, correct?
Exactly. If you did a cost reduction and you weren't able to review the essential design outputs, for risk mitigation, you could really expose the company and patients to unreasonable risk. You design out that risk mitigation to save money, and you could hurt someone. Your company could get sued. It's a very important thing.
When we think about risk management, I guess when I teach it for students, I always teach it from the perspective of the safety of a patient, right? That's kind of your first. But there's also the safety of the company in some ways, correct? I mean, risk management also affects the company's safety and its ability to exist. So if you can talk a little bit more about that as well here.
Sure. So if you have a product, let's say you have a defibrillator, and part of your defibrillator is the capacitors. And you have a element in that design that checks the charge on those capacitors to make sure that they're not dying too early. That cost you $2.95 to put it in. Now, another person has come in, new vice president of manufacturing. He needs to make his name in the company. He sells 10,000 defibrillators a year, and he can save $2.95 per defibrillator. So he takes the cost reduction. So that gets into the field. So now defibrillators start failing on patients during resuscitation. You lose several folks. It comes to light that this defibrillator is defective. FDA causes a recall to happen. Now you're pulling, well, let's see, 10,000 defibrillators a month for 3 years, 30,000 defibrillators off the market. And the damage, just the dollar damage on that is horrendous. Then the damage to reputation and lost future business. And if that was your only product, you're out of business.
Yeah, you don't really want to see the words FDA, your company name, and recall or investigates in the news, really. That's just not a great place to be. Okay, so we have a product, we've designed it, we know how it's going. The product goes into production, it goes into the market. How do you know that your risk mitigations are effective and they remain effective throughout the life cycle as it gets used, as it moves on?
So we've talked about design changes, and we've talked about production updates. So that's covered. But another way you're going to look for risk is through your customer surveillance activities. As you monitor your customer feedback, data analysis is required by 1345 and is required by the FDA regulation to look for adverse trends. And so you're going to be looking, and let's take the defibrillator example again. If I were looking at those data in the field, and I started to see an adverse trend of my defibrillators not working, then I could step in earlier than and save some people some issues. If I were looking at it in my manufacturing area, in market surveillance or in manufacturing surveillance, I may see the capacitors start to fail earlier in my production cycle, and then we could take corrective action. So the other way you can monitor for risk is changes in production and changes in customer surveillance.
And one of the things that, as I think about software as a process, which is a class of medical software effectively, in a regular software, you release your software and sometimes you go away, you put the app on the app store, and that's the end of you may get reviews, you may ignore them, that's the life of software. In the medical world, when you put a medical device on the market, post-market surveillance is an important element. It's required, correct? So you just don't sell something and go away. Your company has to stand behind it for its entire life cycle, correct?
That's correct. And in both the FDA and the EU, during FDA inspections and notified body audits, they're going to look at your customer files, your complaint files. And if you don't meet the regulations on complaint files, your ISO certificate could be in danger, or you could have some serious repercussions from FDA. It is very important to fully integrate the risks of your customer surveillance into your quality system.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about this, and this sounds like a very involved process. So we know that the process is spread throughout the quality system, throughout the life cycles. It's a complicated system. How do you train people in risk management? How to ensure that this process is actually followed? And I guess that's the last part of our discussion on.
That's a pretty important part, the training part, because if you don't have folks that are adequately trained, they're not going to effectively implement the system. So 14971, the ISO risk management standard, requires companies to write procedures for risk management. These procedures will define the steps to be taken to analyze the risk of a device and to evaluate the impact of the risk. The procedure will then discuss how to control the risk and evaluate any residual risk, and it will identify production and post-production activities. So for the day-to-day activities of employees, it may be sufficient to train them to the risk management procedures to execute those activities. But that's the person doing their job day to day. You may want to also develop subject matter experts in risk management. And those would be the go-to people when you have more complex questions. And I'd recommend courses from the Regulatory Affairs Professional Society, known as RAPS, or other qualified training providers. Then alternative, you could study ISO 14971 and compare it against the requirements of 1345 as an individual study exercise. So those are kind of the three different ways to approach the training to the risk management.
Okay, Rich, thank you for answering our questions for our students. I think they'll find it informative and they'll get a little bit of a better appreciation of what quality management systems are and why they are important for a company to have in place. That's that.